Welcome. Thank you all for coming out today in this absolutely miserable weather. This event is hosted as part of the Corporate University Project of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, or 3CT. Before we begin, in addition to thanking all of you for attending, I would like to thank Anna Searle-Jones and Ryan Eckelt of 3CT for their help in organizing this event, and our student assistants, Lucy De Silva and Delaney Wallace, for their work also. I would also like to introduce our three wonderful colleagues who have agreed to take time out of their day to talk to us about the potential and pitfalls that AI might pose for the corporate university, or just the university more broadly, or beyond that. And I say this notwithstanding the fact that obviously our endowment will have suffered some of the $1 trillion wipeout that hit the US stock market this week, so hopefully there's potentials that exceed that massive downside risk. So firstly, we're going to hear from Andy Eggers, who's a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. His research focuses on electoral systems, strategic voting, and research methodology. After Andy, we're going to hear from Taylor Fairs, who is the digital scholarship librarian at the University of Chicago, where she supports student and faculty in digital scholarship research and development. Fairs holds a master's degree in information science from the University of Michigan School of Information. And last but by no means least, Anton Ford is associate professor in philosophy at the University of Chicago and a 3CT fellow. His primary research and teaching interests are in practical philosophy, understood broadly to include action theory, ethics, and political philosophy. Figures of special interest include Anscombe, Aristotle, and Marx. So we've asked the three speakers to each speak for about 5 to 10 minutes on what they take to be the potential of AI for those of us involved in the activity of the university, or the challenges or pitfalls that it might pose for us. Once they're done, I may or may not at that point ask a question or two. Otherwise, we will be throwing it open to the floor. So please, if questions arise for you during the course of the presentation, make a note of them and hold on to them. We're looking forward to a very lively discussion after the panelists are finished. So please join me in welcoming Andy Eggers to start us off.
Okay, thanks very much. So we each come at this from different perspectives, not just the panelists, but everyone in the audience. And I want to make sure that we don't go on too long, because I think there's so much knowledge accumulated here, and we want to do some discussion. My particular role, I think, I want to start by talking a little bit about sort of my mental model of what generative AI, in particular large language models, are doing. Give a few sort of stories about my experiences with these things so far, both in sort of frivolous uses and also research uses, and how I see them also as like a journal editor and advisor and person who goes to a lot of seminars, like how people are using these tools for research in social science. So those of you who are, AI researchers will find the first part very boring when I explain how I think about these things, and those of you who are social science researchers may also recognize a lot of the things I'm going to talk about the way it's being used in social science. So hopefully those things won't be too boring. But I want to just, I guess, to sort of preview my overall message here is that I think, although I know that for a lot of people, particularly in the humanities, the appeal of these technologies is maybe hard to discern relative to the risks. And I want to give you a sense of why, for a lot of social scientists, this seems like actually really exciting, and why why people are really rushing to use a lot of these things in research, which I hope to many of you at this point will seem like a terrible idea, but maybe I can convince you that it's not a terrible idea. So first of all, what are these large language models? When I teach, I have a few of my students from intro statistics here, so they may recognize this, but when we teach about predictive models and conditional probability, LLMs are actually a really nice teaching example. They're models that are meant to sort of predict what's coming next in a stream of text. Okay, so I remember a few years ago, Gmail had this kind of feature where it would like suggest the next word, and it was sort of fun. It could be funny to just keep on pushing the word and produce like a nonsensical email. I don't know if any of you were doing this, but I did this from time to time. It was kind of funny. Anyway, this is like an extension of that obviously has made huge leaps and has some interface improvements that make it do what I think are some astonishing things. So the fact that you can train a model on like basically all the text that you can gather on the internet and elsewhere from books, from Twitter, from whatever, a huge amount of text, train a model that's able to predict what's going to come next in a stream of text is, it's not surprising that you can make a predictive model that would do that. What's surprising is the intelligibility and apparent intelligence that comes from such a process. So I think, as much as it makes stupid mistakes, and it's funny sometimes the kinds of mistakes it makes, and I'll give you some examples of things I've encountered, I do think it's an astonishing accomplishment to make a model that can ingest so much text and produce something that has the sort of aura of intelligent thought. Now, how does that actually work? Underlying it is a statistical model called a neural network, or more specifically a transformer, which is basically a huge amount of very simple pieces that are put together and then trained on a huge amount of text through a bunch of different iterations. So these GPTs, you can think of them as like, they've got this brain. So I'm saying brain because the neural network is modeled after a brain, which is itself a huge number of connections among simple bits. It's got this brain. It's lived many, many lifetimes reading everything that's possible to read. And then what it's doing is sort of talking like the text that it's encountered. Okay? So what I think is an interesting thing about this is that there's no one who designed these models and created these models who knew just what it would do once it was released, right? So like, there's no one who can kind of explain this much better than what I've just, I'm sure I made some mistakes, but there's not some like inner structure that I'm not telling you about, but like, much more inner structure. The key thing is just a very flexible, huge model with tons of parameters, trained on a huge amount of text, and then we see what it does. And we are all figuring out what it does. And what I'm telling you is that there's no one at OpenAI who can tell you a much deeper insight into what it's doing beyond like, well, this is what it seems to do when we do this. This is what it seems to do when we do that. Like it's not a well understood model. So what happens when we do things with it? So I'll tell you about a research task that I'm doing right now, for which it's great. So for a project I'm working on, I'm trying to characterize a shift in social science, or measure whether there has been a shift in social science away from kind of explanation towards measurement, right? So these are different research tasks that people can undertake. I have a data set of 20,000, at the moment, abstracts, but I could scale that up to many, many more, of journal articles from different social science journals over the past several decades. And a question I wanted to ask about these abstracts is this paper addressing a fundamentally explanatory question, or is it just measuring something? Or is it something in between? That task, another task I'd like to ask about these abstracts is, what's the research question? That's another, and what are the methods that are being used in this? And what I would like, ideally, is like a data set, like to turn these 20,000 abstracts into a data set with 20,000 rows with a column for each of these characteristics. Like, tell me what the research question is. What kind of research question is it? What kind of method are they using? I want to do this because I'm trying to make an argument about like how we should be thinking about explanatory problems in social science, the need for more thinking about this. So that part I'm not going to ask the LLM to do anything about. But this first part of asking someone to read 20,000 abstracts and make a data set out of it is a task where I'm not going to do that task. I could ask a research assistant to do like a subset of them, like a sample of them, and the research assistant would do that to some degree satisfying to me. Like it would be, they'd miss some stuff, whatever it would be. But what I found is that like the GPT-4 or the Phoenix AI that the university has produced does an extraordinarily good job of turning abstracts into these observations that I want from my data set. Now, as you know, a crucial feature of these models is that it will give you an answer whether it knows the answer or not. So if you ask a question, it will give you an answer. Almost always. And sometimes it'll say, like, I'm sorry, I don't know that. And I think what you'll see with these things, my prediction is that it'll be better at doing that over time. Because it seems like a solvable problem to be able to say, I'm in an area where I don't know what text should go next, and so I'm just going to shut up. But as we all know, some people are capable when asked a question of just bullshitting anyway. And so like here I am talking to you about something that, so people sometimes manage not to do it, and so these models also, but they do it in extraordinary ways and very funny ways. So of course, whenever we ask an LLM to do something, we need some way of like validating that it's correct. And this, for a lot of people, this means it sounds utterly useless. If I have to know what the answer is in order to get a reliable answer, then by definition, this is like obviously not going to work. But the thing is, what I want to convey to you, if you're coming from outside social science, the part of social science I do, that may be how you'll think about it. You'll be thinking, if you need to know the answer in order to know if it's doing a good job, then what's the point? Well, the thing is that we're used to this kind of problem. We're always coming, in social science, we're always coming up with like measures for things that are dubious and imperfect. We're also often delegating the task of reading something and classifying something to others. Like we often have people, we often have a case where we design a code book and then we ask someone to implement it and get back the results, right? So this is a little bit cruel, actually, but Gary King at Harvard has this, this software that's supposed to help with like processing a lot of text and labeling texts. And the function in the software is called undergrad, because you make an undergrad do that. And now you can use his software to do it. So this is like an extension of something that we were doing already. So, which is, we have a task that is basically about labeling something. It's not life or death. We're not trying to make a car drive through Times Square or something. It's something where we can tolerate some mistakes. And we are aware of those mistakes. We're OK with those mistakes in certain circumstances. And we have a lot of experience thinking about like how do we check whether the mistakes are sort of tolerable. So this is just another, for us, I feel this is another tool that does that. So when I ask it to label abstracts in this way, it's another task where I'm getting some stuff back, I'm going to validate it, I'll compare it against stuff I do myself, I'll compare it against stuff research assistants do. So this is all to say that like if you're asking the LLM to like read a poem for you so that you can write a piece of literary analysis, then I think that sounds like a terrible idea. But if the alternative is to read a sample of these texts or ask someone else to do it who's less reliable or whatever, then for us this seems to be very exciting. I just want to tell I feel like I'm going on too long. I want to tell one more quick little story about what LLMs can do and cannot do. So a funny task to ask these models is please produce a list of the US states that don't have the letter R in them, okay? So I don't know if people have seen this task implemented. So if you ask it to do this, you get back a list of states. It will confidently give you a list of states. When I've done it before, it always includes some states with the letter R. So Vermont and California were in the list the last time I checked. Like very confidently, lists out a bunch of states. Yeah, Vermont, California, Delaware. Like you'll just throw out some stuff with R in the name. If you ask the same LLM, could you please write some code that will help me that will identify which states have the letter R in them? It will give you exactly the right solution. Okay? So it'll start with a list. It'll give you the whole list of states, and it'll give you a little loop, and it'll go through the loop and say, break each state name into individual letters, go through and check to see if any of them are R, and then if none of them are R, put it in this list, and then return the list that was produced for that process. So it'll tell you the right code to write, but it won't tell you the right list. Okay? So this is like another, I think this little vignette tells you something about how it can expand your abilities to, if you kind of know something about how to solve the problem anyway and how to check whether the answer is correct. And so I think this is very exciting. Of course, there's many scary potential impacts of this that I haven't addressed, but I felt my brief was kind of to explain to people who maybe don't know this area of research why we have some excitement about it and how it fits into other things that we're sort of doing already.
Great, thank you, Taylor.
All right, so thank you for inviting me here today. I'm going to give a librarian's perspective on AI. I'm going to talk a little bit about our information landscape and what the library's hopes are in addressing this. I also wanted to start with an anecdote. So around a year ago, almost to the date, I was preparing an iteration of a workshop that I do on hallucination. Andy talked a little bit about this, used the word. So hallucination is when AI comes up with a response that is inaccurate or misleading without any known source as to where that's coming from. And I wanted an example of it. So I asked ChatGPT to give me a literature review, an annotated bibliography actually, about the role of nature in Macbeth. And of the 5 articles that it gave me, only 1 was completely accurate. The rest were pretty believable. They had either existing scholars in this landscape or a correct title with an incorrect journal. But all of them, again, were very believable, so I decided to test it a little bit. I asked ChatGPT to help me find one of the articles that it gave me, the hallucinated one. And after a little bit of back and forth, ChatGPT gave me an amazing answer. It told me to ask a librarian. When I started working at the library a little bit over a year ago, I definitely didn't expect to be the AI person, and I'm definitely not the only AI person at the library. We've had to be pretty nimble in our response in navigating this and building up our capacity to answer the questions that are coming up around this new technology or set of technologies. And in doing that, we've had a lot of conversations, both within the library and outside of it. We've been working with partners across the university, folks like in the Chicago Center for Teaching and Learning and Academic Technology Solutions, as we try to figure out what our niche is and what we want to focus on so we're not duplicating efforts and we're really making the most impact. And the result of this has been a focus on literacy, specifically AI literacy training for students. There's a lot of really great work being done around campus that's geared towards instructors as they engage with AI. But up until recently, there have been fewer opportunities for students, specifically those not in computational disciplines, to critically engage with the set of technologies that is now available to us. And this is a gap, and we want to address it. Returning briefly to my opening anecdote, AI tools like ChatGPT offer what seems like an effective shortcut for often the long and arduous process of research. When in fact there are not shortcuts, we need to be proactive about giving students tools and advice and showing students when it's useful and when it might not be. So in many ways, this might be just my perspective. I think the library is uniquely positioned to handle the impact that AI is already having on our information landscape. Questions surrounding authority and accuracy of information are not new. Librarians have been dealing with them as long as there have been libraries. What's changed in many ways is the scale. Students no longer just have to evaluate information from seemingly endless online sources, but they're now also being tasked with evaluating information on the fly, often with little to no insight as to where that information came from. That's not easy. Often this information sounds convincing, and that's one particularly problematic aspect of generative AI, is that inaccurate information can be written quite fluently. And we don't often know where the data is coming from. That's the black box issue of AI tools. So another issue is that an inaccurate response is it written convincingly, and in order to actually work with this response, to see past that fluff and meaningfully engage with AI-generated content, often you need some level of subject matter expertise, which is something Andy brought up. These are things we want our students to know, and I think students are coming to realize this, but we want to make sure we're giving those opportunities, and that's because AI is not going to go away. Even if students choose not to use these tools and happen only to take classes in which the use of AI is not permitted, AI will still impact their information environment. It already has. Over the past year, we're trying to make that our priority. So just equipping students with the tools that they need so they can actually make a decision for themselves whether they want to engage or not engage with this technology. So in my opinion, that's our step one from the library's perspective, which is just focusing on students and that AI literacy. But the description of the event did lay out there are implications for AI that go beyond the classroom. AI is touted as time-saving and cost-cutting, and I think we should be approaching these claims in a responsible and grounded way. Cost-saving automation has to be weighed against the high energy cost of training and using these models, and we have to contend with the risk that automating tasks has the potential to reinforce existing biases. Speaking from the library, our collections and metadata aren't free from bias, and if we remove the human from the decision-making process, that has the potential to exacerbate this. Information and classification are always discursive, it's always fraught, and it takes a good deal of specialized knowledge to deal with this. That being said, I want to close out by acknowledging that we should be precise in our language. The library does already engage with AI in some capacity, even if we don't always think of these use cases being AI. Transcription for greater accessibility is something that AI is great at doing, as is AI is great for doing optical character recognition, or rather making it better. And while we don't currently have the capacity to do handwritten text recognition, I think that's a really exciting world where we can explore. So I want to wrap up by trying to tie the two topics I just discussed together and answering a question how AI might influence our scholarly environment. We have to consider how we're training students and our just community to evaluate and engage with information, as well as how we're making that information available. One major issue with generative AI is either we don't know what it's being trained on, or there isn't a lot of access to high quality data. Some of you might have seen this, but AI doesn't do super well when it's trained on AI-generated data. And this is all to say that it does, in fact, need us. In short, they need our data. And for those of us engaged in knowledge production and organization and curation, we actually have somewhat of an opportunity to help shape this landscape and the discourse around it. And that can be in exercising productive restraint, educating the public on information literacy, and sometimes maybe working to make AI better. Thank you.
Anton.
I think my role on this panel is to be the doomsayer, and so I'll oblige. I mean, there are obviously big things afoot at the university. The president announced that there's going to be a huge initiative, research initiative. There may be a restructuring of the divisions. And as everybody knows, the university created and delivered to the whole community its own generative AI, Phoenix AI. All of this has happened without discussion, any reflection on whether this is a good idea, what it means to give our undergraduates implicit permission to run wild with this. It's really, you know, I mean, fine, but I do think we should reflect on it, and I'm going to express some of my own worries as somebody who teaches in the philosophy department in the humanities. What's happening here is, of course, just a sign of the times. When the internet took off, you know, this didn't happen, and there's a lot of money going into this and a lot of energy, and it may not be stoppable, but we should. It doesn't mean we shouldn't reflect on what's happening. Although I'm going to say I'm going to express worries. I also want to say I don't think that there's anything inherently bad about the technology itself. I mean, I think, like, you know, large-scale machinery, it's very good to have labor-saving devices. But I mean, the question, I mean, well, what's good about it? I'll just say, what seems good about it is, you know, human beings don't have to do all that crappy drudge work that they would otherwise have to do, and they could maybe do something more valuable with their time. But you know, just like with large-scale machinery, that's not the reason it's introduced, and that's not the reason that there's enthusiasm for it and money is put into it. I mean, it's introduced into our society and takes over the production and the work that happens in our society because it's going to make somebody a lot of money, and that's really a different kind of goal than freeing human beings up to do things that are valuable with their time. And that's the character of my worry, and I think it's a special worry for people who do cultural work, And I'm going to say something about that in general. But more specifically, I want to just talk about worries for teachers and pedagogical concerns, specifically about literacy. Now, when it comes to cultural work in general, I think very often the discussion moves to the question whether AI can do something that is just as good as a human would do. And where just as good as means, basically the product is indistinguishable by a human being from what a human being would produce. And then some people who are optimistic say, why not? And some people who feel doom and gloom like me say, oh no, it could never happen, or it's just a simulacrum or something like this. I want to shift I think there's the focus away from the question about the quality of the product or the indistinguishability of the product from a human product to the side of producing it, because I think it's very easy to lose. It's true. It's wonderful to have a beautiful poem. It's enriching to read it, and so on and so forth. But it's also good to write poems. It's good that people do that with their time. When we're talking about labor-saving devices, we want to cut out of human experience things that are just drudgery and pointless in themselves. But writing poems is not that kind of thing. We don't write poems because there aren't enough poems in the world. And the same is true of college essays. But I'll come back. No, seriously, it's not that's not the point. So, having a labor-saving device for something that the worry is about having labor-saving devices for things that are good for us to do. If you took a robot to the gym with you and had it lift the weight, there's no point in that. Or if you had AI do a crossword puzzle for you, that would save a lot of time. But it's not the point. The point is not could it come up with the solutions faster or could it get the weight off the ground. That is just not, you're missing something completely if you're focusing on whether the thing could be done in a way that saves time and energy. The whole point is doing it. So anyway, I just feel like that's given the economic motive of the introduction and proliferation of this technology, given that we live in a world where if it can be done more cheaply, more quickly, no one will get to do it. There's a real worry that has nothing to do with the quality of the products. If nobody gets to have this kind of work, that's a problem in itself. Now, specifically for us, that is for people who work at schools, I think there's a worry specifically about literacy. By literacy, I mean facility with the written word. The production and consumption of prose, or composing prose, comprehending prose. That's what I mean. That's one of the main things that school is for. From kindergarten through the end of your doctoral education and beyond that into scholarship, reading and writing prose is very, very important. It's there's no such thing as school without this. I mean, there's arithmetic, yeah, but reading and writing are two of the three R's. This is absolutely fundamental to the kind of institution that a school is, literacy. And people have talked a lot about writing and the way that AI comes between the producer of the written word and the written word, and in a way that's, to my mind, it coming between the crossword puzzle solver and the solution to the puzzle. But I think there's another side of it too in reading, and this was alluded to. I mean, one thing that AI is very good at is reading something and offering you a summary of it. And I find it incredible. I find it very difficult to see how, given its ability to do that, we avoid a situation where it soon becomes normal for students and frankly for scholars to read things by reading a summary of the text. I think that is just as profound an attack on, or a threat to literacy, general literacy, as using AI to produce a text, or to produce a text that we then go on to edit or something. I mean, the act of reading, living with a text, figuring out why words were chosen, why it's structured in a certain way, what's important, what's not, what's decoration, what's actual architecture. Like that act, and being able to synthesize it, that is like lifting weights or solving a crossword puzzle. No one can do it for you, and that is one half of literacy. I mean, I think. And what happens to being able to read when what you read is a summary or an abstract produced by a machine, which is anyway controlled by some large corporation, which is only interested in making money, and not interested in, whose whole goal is orthogonal to that of understanding, has nothing essential to do with it, would only coincidentally coincide with it. I mean, I think it's exactly similar between the producer of the written word and the written word. I think it just these two. And I'll just stress. I think reading and writing are not related like walking and chewing gum. They're not just two things that one can do together. I mean, it's more like inhaling and exhaling. The one is for the other. You write for the sake of being read. You read what you take to have been written for the sake of reading. Like they're interdefine. If you screw up one of these, and when I say you, if we lose one of these, the other is gone. Because what happens what happens to writing when it is the writer's expectation that, supposing what you write is of any length, it will be read through a summary produced by AI. Like what happens to worrying about word choice or tone or wit or structure or the act of composition, all of the elements of composition. It's just there's just no point. And I think similarly with reading, what is the point of reading something that may have been produced by or likely was produced by AI? I mean, this is relevant for grading. The more plausible, the more likely it is that the essays we are reading were produced by AI, the more untenable it becomes to do the only thing that's valuable, pedagogically speaking, which is to try to figure out what this author actually meant, or how they're actually confused. Like, what's going on here? What are they really trying to say? The more it seems unlikely that there's a fact of that matter, the crazier it is, and the more untenable it is to grade, and to provide, not to grade. I mean, grading, forget grading. To give comments. It's and so I think there's, and. So I think these things are intimately related, and I don't really see how one stops it exactly. It's a general thing. Literacy is general. It's a social phenomenon. It's not something, reading is something, not because of what we do on this campus, but like in general. We don't control that. So I don't see how to, or what the prospect is for stopping that. And I just want to, but I nevertheless think it's worth pausing over what will go away if literacy is degraded in this way, in a general way, and that this is something that affects us in the humanities and humanistic social sciences in a way it doesn't affect other parts of the university. And I don't think, and I think if, I don't think it's a coincidence that the dean of the college, the provost, the president of this university are not humanists. Like, I think for a humanist, it's like a very big deal that all of our students now have AI to read and write with. And I think it should give us pause.
Thank you, Anton. Just one thing, I'm going to have a question, but when we get to the Q&A, I'm going to have to run this microphone to whoever wants to speak before you speak, because otherwise the recording won't pick it up. So Anton, you're going to need to borrow one of these mics when, if you have something you need to say. So I want to pick up a little bit on where Anton ended. So that, at least as I hear you, Anton, the point is that, like, by writing a bad essay, and of course, lots of undergraduates write bad essays, not because they aren't trying hard, but because it's hard to write good essays. And so you have to write bad ones to learn how to write a good one. But in the activity of writing a bad essay, and then getting feedback and then writing the next essay, one gains, at least in theory, a certain kind of mastery over one's facility with the written word. And I think that there's one way to be very ungenerous to Andy's opening intervention is that, like, he has a great deal of confidence that the AI will gain mastery over writing. And I think the problem is, even if, and I should say I'm completely skeptical of this, I do not think an AI is ever going to write a great work of literature. I don't think it can express anything about the human experience that would be worth reading. I think it's just all garbage. But it's very well presented garbage, usually. I don't think an AI can write to our experience in a way that should capture our attention. And I will say most of my experience of AI is derived from scrolling on Twitter, and the level of confidence people have in the quality of the output of AI as good writing seems to me to reflect nothing more than the fact that these people have terrible judgment. And so I want to talk a little bit about judgment, because I think one of the problems is that, and this is sort of on two levels, one of the problems is that if the AI gains mastery over writing, we don't. And if we don't, we will then lose the capacity to tell whether or not what the AI has developed is in fact mastery over writing. And so, it's fine in a world in which Andy has gone through a pretty advanced education and developed mastery over his subject, such that he can look at the output of the AI and say, well, that's bullshit, but that's valuable. And I suppose I worry, like, who a generation from now is going to have that capacity? It's going to have retained the capacity to read and write and think in a way capable of exercising judgment over arguably the most important thing we in the university should care about with respect to writing, and you might be deflationary in respect of this, but the truthfulness or falsity of the thing that is put before you. And so one way to think about, Andy, the way in which you described large language models working is they produce thought, all of these words, reading, thought, writing, whatever, they're all in scare quotes because they're not actually the thing that we mean by it, but nevertheless, they produce a thought. It is raining, right? That's the thought. And then our job is to look outside and say, yes, it is raining. But that's not what we do when we say it is raining. We don't have a thought, it is raining, and then go to experience to confirm whether or not our judgment about the truth or falsity of the statement is correct. We say it's raining, and we contain in the thought the judgment itself, right? That there's no separate maneuver. And I think the problem with the large language model picture that Andy presents is it acts as if what human beings are creatures of content production, and then separately creatures of judgment. And I think that is both a mistake about what kinds of things we're doing when we utter words in language, but it also is an impoverished understanding about what is involved in the activity of thinking. And my worry is that when we tell our students, as Phoenix AI does when they go to Phoenix AI and it prompts them with, if you want to generate ideas for your essay, you can type in the following thing into Phoenix AI. So it gives them a step-by-step, or gives you, I suppose, to some of you, a step-by-step guide as to how you can think or write about the essay you have been assigned to think or write about. And I think all of those scare-quoted words are empty. I don't think they mean what students think they mean. And I think by encouraging students to use this technology and producing this smooth bullshit that sounds like it answers the question, students begin to think that actually all writing is the activity of producing endless, did I write the next word correctly? Did I pick the right next word to write this paper on Hobbes's Leviathan? And if I did pick the right next word, then I'm going to get an A. And if I didn't pick the right next word, then I'm going to get an A-. And I think that there's a way in which we are hollowing out the category of the thing we're supposed to be involved in doing here, which is pursuing knowledge and pursuing truth, and turning it into an activity of mere content production, completely divorced from the judgment of truth and falsity, and then the judgment is what we add. And so this is just another sort of, to put this to Taylor, the idea that we work for the AI, right? The AI needs us to work correctly, right? Well, then it needs us to have what Andy has, which is the capacity for judgment to tell the AI, no, you've invented a citation by Richard Stryer on Macbeth. He never wrote a paper called that thing. Now, please correct yourself for the future. But if we lose the capacity to tell the difference between true and false, then how is it that this, the new division of artificial intelligence isn't going to just swallow up our intellectual capacities, swallow up our capacity for judgment, and become just a sort of day-to-day industrial-sized representation of the hollowing out of truth that is also our daily political reality?
Unfortunately, for the interest of some drama, I agree with all that. So I have a son who's 8, and he's doing a lot of addition by hand with he's getting in his head the idea that if you're adding 8 plus 5, you can think about it as 8, and then 2 of the 5 gets you up to 10, and then you add 3 at the end of that, so that ends up with 13, right? So this is a task that has been solved by computers for a long time, but he's thinking it through, and he's weightlifting, right? So he's doing something that's moving the furniture of his brain in order to make him a perceptive person who knows something about, who's able to apply those muscles to other things, and it's awesome. It's so great, and I'm very worried about whether writing is thinking, right? So you can have a good idea, you try to write it down, it's not a good idea. Right? And so can you work that out by having a good idea, putting an outline of it into the LLM and having it write it? Sounds like maybe it's worth a try, but I think it's hard for us as old fogies who've lived through this world in which we lift those weights to see how those connections get made otherwise. I mean, as Anton was talking about getting rid of some of the drudgery, I was thinking about translation. And I was thinking about my many years studying Japanese and how I had to look up the characters, the Chinese characters in dictionaries by you figure out how many strokes there are total and figure one of the radicals, and okay, now I'm going to look in the back, and it's like that. That can be done. I'm done with that. I don't want to do that anymore. I don't think there was any value to figuring out how to look up characters from a dictionary by counting the strokes and figuring out which radical to look it up by. I think that was probably drudgery that I can do without. But there's so many other things that I had to do that were that I feel were sort of character and judgment building, and so I absolutely agree with that. And so it seems like we have these repertoire of alternatives, right? So we can take the things that we do make people do now. We can enforce that they don't use these tools so that they have to go through the weightlifting and develop those muscles, right? We can teach them how to use those things to support the muscle building. Or we could decide, look, I'm not going to make you look up kanji anymore. That's not a task that I think was valuable. And then we got to think about sort of like what new tasks do we teach people. But that said, like I do think that has to be the way forward. I mean, that's just like definitionally, that's all the options. But yeah, I'm seriously concerned about how my children can develop the kind of muscles and mental furniture that I feel like is important with this crutch available all the time. I mean, they've always, sorry to go on like this, we have always had crutches available. You could always have a tutor or a parent who could help you out, and they would have different degrees of ethical responsibility and sort of withhold the information appropriately rather than just doing it for you. That's always been there, and now it's just like so present and so free and so available and so full of bullshit.
Can I just?
Yeah.
I just want to press back a little bit on the
Sure.
translation thing, but
Yeah.
you've just put your finger on
Yeah.
a big button of mine. So like I get that maybe if what you're doing retranslate this same passage out of Cicero
Yeah.
to let you know that you know what Latin is.
Okay, sorry, go ahead. I'll let you go. I just want to say I think translation is great. I just think there was a component of the translation that I was having to do.
Okay, so you're not saying that you would AI all?
No,
like,
no,
you
that's
would
the problem. So I think it's
AI
really, yeah. So I think it's so. Sorry, you had a great point to make, but it was a response to something I wasn't saying. So I think translation. I think learning foreign languages is one of those muscle building things that I cherish in my own education, and I would not want to take that from someone. And this is one of the things that LLMs do incredibly well. You dump a bunch of text and say translate this to Japanese. It's like astonishingly. It's like, as I said, astonishingly good, right? So it's doing the weightlifting for you, and I really would not like that muscle to be deprived of like for myself, like anyone. It's a terrible thing. It's just that there's a component of it that I would call drudgery, which is, in this case, looking up kanji by counting the strokes and et cetera. I think that part is disposable. The part that's not disposable is like thinking about meaning and grammar and like developing your ability to remember things and to form words and sentences and express emotion and think in a different, like all that stuff is really great. And if we just have little talk boxes on our ears that just like turns what we're thinking into French or something, I do think that's a loss, right? That's a massive loss. I mean, it's a gain in some ways, but it's a massive loss. Sorry.
Yeah, I can. I also don't disagree with what you were saying. I think there is a genuine concern about losing the ability to read and to write, and that there is a genuine benefit to doing these things yourself. And it's really a question of what is process-oriented, like when is the practice the point, and what is product-oriented. And I think language is a really great example of that, because even though I agree with these concerns, I'm maybe a little more optimistic about people's desire to still exercise these muscles.
Right.
And I think language is a really good example of that. So prior to my work here, I worked at a language center. And I feel like we had this freak out with Google Translate. And I feel like we were all really afraid. My mom is also a Spanish teacher, and we were really afraid that because Google Translate could now do this work, no one would want to learn a language, and everybody would cheat. And this is not to say that students don't. They absolutely do use Google Translate, but my mom still can tell. And people are still interested in learning languages. I saw it all the time when I was working in the language center. There's a genuine interest in exercising that muscle, in allowing yourself to be immersed in another culture. And that's not, I don't think, going to go away in reading or in writing. And I think we just have to be very conscientious about letting our students know when it is important to exercise these muscles, and just being really proactive about that.
People may. I mean, I think we're on the cusp of something, and so it's very difficult to. I don't know. You always sound. I know I sound like a Luddite and a lunatic, but like, I think there's I think it's easy to be glib if you already, not glib, but like to underestimate the impending loss if you already have the skills in question. You're not gonna. You just see all the affordances. You just see all the new stuff you can do on top of what you can do. But in like one generation, we have kids the same, same age. Like, I just worry that that's not going to be true, and they're not going to miss anything, and they're not going to have whatever desires you see when you look around now. Yeah, sure, that's people who grew up in a certain context, a certain educational environment. That's not. It doesn't. It doesn't tell us what people are what desires there are gonna be in a generation. What there are two of my students from Phil Perspectives in the class, and what it was at the beginning of the year. I had to confront the question what to say about AI, and these are people who are kids who are just coming from high school, and I said basically, I'm not going to be a narc, but don't use it. I don't recommend you use it because you are like the last cohort of human beings who learned how to write and read without it. You have like a precious historical position. Don't underestimate how important it is. We're going to try to cultivate that thing that you still have, but that in like 10 years people aren't going to come to school with, which is the ability to come up with something. I mean, it's generative AI. Coming up with something is hard. Generating stuff is hard, and it's different from editing. Like, writing is one thing, editing is a different thing. So if you using AI to like come up with an outline and like make a first pass at a paragraph, and then you work on that is not the same as writing. That is editing. That's what's. I mean, this isn't. I mean, that's what's special about the technology. It generates stuff. But that's what that's creation. That's the composition and creation. That's what we're supposed to be doing. Anyway, sorry, I'm going on.
Yeah, let's get to that.
Okay, we're going to open things up. So I'm just going to run around like I'm on some game show, and you can ask your questions. And we're just going to go one at a time for now, but if there are enough questions, we might start gathering them together. So.
Should I stand up? I'll stay seated. So I just think this image of lifting weights is very telling, because this is actually something we do now that we don't have to till the land. We don't have any sort of like meaningful labor that we have to do in order to survive, and so we go to the gym to like do this sort of exercise. And I don't think that writing poetry is the same thing; it never was. But I see a sort of I think like the connection or the point you're making about education and how important it is to do this work. It really pertains to the developmental stage. And we could think of adulthood as the correlate to what you call the product, or like instead of the activity, we now have the product, except that I don't think there ever is a product. I think that human beings never really do fully develop. There's no end to that development. And so this idea that we have of like training in the gym for something, I guess I don't really know what the point is that I'm making. But I'm fascinated with this obsession we have with like the product and a kind of smooth surface or something that we can present to the world as though it kind of fell out of the sky ahistorically, as if to like disavow our entire developmental stage or the time that we were children. So I wonder what you make of that.
I didn't. I mean, we don't ever grow up in the relevant sense. I mean, that is, it's important. It's important to schooling, but reading and writing is. You don't stop learning to read and write. I think. I agree. I agree with your point about lifting weights. It was. The crossword puzzle is the same. Like there are things you do. You're right. You don't. There are things that can't be done for you, and that was the main point. That the point without doing. Now maybe lifting weights is a bad example. I should stick with crossword puzzles you know, because you don't lift weights for its own sake, but you do crossword puzzles for its own sake. There is some value in doing crossword puzzles. It's fun for some people, not for me in particular, but like people love it. Anyway, I don't know. Yeah, I don't have more to add.
Yeah, I would also just say, I think yes, the lifting weights analogy is a really cool one because people still do, even though they don't necessarily have to, but that is a little bit more of a product-oriented goal. But I would also just say that people still do crosswords if they find them interesting, despite the fact that auto check exists and people turn that off. And I don't know if it's just that we're a more internally motivated group because we didn't grow up with auto check, or if that's just something that is inherent to us.
Can I just say one more word about the lifting weights thing? The reason that what suggested it to me in the first place, what is this product orientation point? ChatGPT, in philosophy, there's a very familiar kind of assignment, written assignment, namely reconstruct the argument and critically evaluate it. ChatGPT can, especially if we're dealing with a text that's 2,000 years old and has been written about for that entire time, ChatGPT can produce something that is, that is perhaps indistinguishable from the work of an incoming freshman. So what? Does that mean it's not an important thing for an incoming freshman to learn how to do? Like, does that mean so? And now, and then we'll be told, well, you have to come up with more interesting and idiosyncratic assignments. Why? That's what one needs to learn how to do. The fact that there's now a machine that can do it in a way that I can't tell the difference. Hypothetically, suppose it were true. I'm not a skeptic about like its ability to do this eventually. So what? Like it's still the kind of thing that one needs to be able to do for oneself, and the only way to do it is by lifting those weights and doing it.
Yeah. And I think there's a new need for us to make the case for these skills, right? You have to convince people that there's something to get out of this course other than an A-. Absolutely. And that's the reason why we have, like the suggestion to change the assignment is, well, the students just want to get an A- and they can do it with ChatGPT. So you have to make the case that writing is thinking is good, this is good for you, and so that's our challenge. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you. I wanted to build on the point you were just making about previous coming generations and the current generation being the last to have these important thinking skills and writing skills, right? And I've been thinking about how we support, in education, cognitive apprenticeship, especially in the next generations that will have these things available, because I think part of my concern is, for example, like if there are huge moneyed interests that are going to keep AI in our lives and going to keep them a part of students' lives after educational institutions, I'm wondering, what the viability is, or like what the previous successes of just say no, abstinence only type of approaches to things that people can do that you don't want them to do, but they will do, right? And they do short circuit the learning process, especially employed in certain capacities. But there may be ways to support people's development, but what do you make of those? Like what might those be? Or do we basically just have to say don't do it and kind of make the case for learning, en naturel, right?
That's a good point. I don't have anything.
I'm not optimistic about our ability to stop, I don't know what to do. Or what the right way forward is. But I do think, I do have some, sorry. I think there's something that's inevitably going to be, I think some of this is inevitable, and I think there are going to be inevitable losses, but I think a way of putting that into context is to think, for example, about the introduction of writing as such, which must have led to a real atrophy of various cognitive powers, such as memory. And I can imagine being at the cusp of that and thinking, this is going to be terrible.
People made exactly that point.
This is going to be awful. Can you imagine? Like, people aren't going to be able to think anymore. They're not going to be able to hold anything in their little pea heads for very long. And there was something to that, like no doubt. I mean, and there were certain, professions disappeared, like those of the bards, or that. In retrospect, do I think this was like a bad thing? No. But I do think it's really, but nevertheless, I do think it was totally integral, the emergence of writing, and I just want to stress again, like absolutely central to everything that happens, at least in the humanities division. And so if that if that turns out to be like, an obsolete thing, then we turn out to be obsolete, I think.
I liked what you talked about when it comes to like how do we make the case to students to not take the shortcuts, and I think there are ways to do that. I also think it bears looking into why students take shortcuts whenever we have these conversations. So looking at exactly what it is that is motivating students to not use, or to use ChatGPT or use Phoenix AI in a way that is unproductive, and then try to find ways to, I guess, intervene. So from the library's perspective, that is giving students the tools they need to effectively research without taking shortcuts, and acknowledging that there aren't really shortcuts, that the struggle and the reading widely is the point. But it's still really frustrating to not understand how to do a basic search and to keep searching for something and using the wrong term, or to not even know where to look. So I think just being proactive about doing that and doing that in the classroom is at least one thing we can do.
I will just say, I'm sorry, I have a couple of people here who have questions, but the imperative that we should prepare our students for a world of AI might seem, seems inevitable that there will be a world of AI. It might be hasty to think that this should be the way in which we should, this should be the front of their educational process. But it does seem to me, to Taylor's point, that we're the ones, not any of us individually, but we as an institution have created a set of incentives for our students that are directly connected to things like financial success, being able to pay off the enormous student loans that they gather to come to an institution like this one. And the best way to do that is to get as many A's as possible, and the best way to get the A's is to produce the output in the classes where you don't really need to do the work, or to get the A so that you can spend the time in the classes that do. But I do worry about the way in which the institution seems to have embraced this frontier as a positive site of student development, simply because they're entering a world of AI. Like, one could imagine that we could also get our students to start training how to goose step effectively around the quads, because it's going to be a useful skill in a couple of years. It doesn't seem like that ought to be, the development of the critical faculty that we aim at, but it does seem to be a large part of the impulse, and that might have something to do with the fact that we have lost tons of money at this institution, or are desperate for our undergraduates to bring as much money back into the institution in the future. And so the incentives we have to align undergraduate incentives toward their future might be perverse, maybe. But anyways.
So I'm curious, I guess this is more for Anton, why not be a narc if the stakes are so high? Is it because you don't have the tools to police and surveil that would make that easier, or are there other reasons? But I guess, why not? I mean, maybe students are using these tools and they're shortchanging themselves, and, why not maybe pursue surveillance?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't have a good answer. I mean, it's always, it's just, I don't know that it was one thing in the age of plagiarism, of mere plagiarism, where people are taking things off the internet. I don't know that are there tools? Is this the sort of thing that you can use, tools to effectively, I just feel like it's
there are tools, but you can't use them effectively.
Yes, I just feel like it's technologically hopeless to do that with a kind of assignment that I don't know what to do. To be honest, I don't have a good answer to, and maybe my attitude heretofore is no longer sustainable. But that has always been my attitude towards cheating and plagiarizing. I mean, I've had the good fortune to be teaching here, where it's not a big, it's not, I think, such a big issue as it is at the place where I went to graduate school and started teaching, for example. Maybe it's not sustainable. I don't know. I don't care. I mean, personally, I don't care about grades. So I think that's I think it's the grading. And I mean, what's the incentive is grades. That I think is, but I can't get rid of that. So I don't know. It's I don't know why not be an architect. I'm no good at it. I don't think I would succeed. It's not what I'm here to do. But maybe the attitude is that my attitude has always been, look, it's your education. I can't learn it. I can't get it for you. I'm going to try and make it interesting, but.
On what he'd already partly addressed, but I've heard several times even phrases like knowledge production, and it's becoming very clear that we produce knowledge now. We aren't being creative, we're not thinking, we are producing. And so I guess my question is there a way of pushing back? Because while the university could say, we're being responsive to outside demands, which is why people want jobs at Goldman and McKinsey, and they want the A, not the A minus, and we need to be able to produce those grades and produce the people who can then fill those jobs. To not do that will cost us money. But on the other hand, can we also teach that maybe this is not the end all and be all because we are supposed to be different? And if so, how do you do that? Like actually practically, if possible.
Everyone's looking at I love that. I love the idea that part of the benefit of making people think about the value of being different from a bullshit generating machine would be to have a deeper appreciation of human values and creativity and things like that. I love the idea of doing that, and I would like to accomplish that. But I don't know how. I hope we do. I hope that's one of the benefits. I can't imagine that's going to be the kind of modal response, but I'm hoping that some people would feel that way about it, that it would clarify for people. And actually, I've heard about this as a pedagogical skill. I don't, probably people in this room have done this or been in a course that used this. Asked ChatGPT to write the essay and then critique it and explain, why is this so boring and flat? What is it about this that's uninsightful, right? I've heard about, and the thing so the version of that I've done teaching a statistics course, and two of my students are here so they can tell you this, is that I was able to honestly say, ChatGPT will give you a vanilla answer to these questions, and this is not a course that's doing a vanilla treatment of statistics. So it was that's a pragmatic solution, which is and it goes to your point about sort of how to, we get told that we should change what we're teaching because you want to make it un-AI-able somehow. In this case, it happened that the vast amount of information that's out there that the AI, the LLM is basically averaging to tell you how to compute a standard error is not exactly how we're doing it in this course, right? Anyway, so that gets a little bit away from your deeper question, right? Which is about how can we sort of change the values that people prioritize as part of this? And my answer, as I said, I hope that will be one benefit of making the case to people that thinking is important and it's a valuable skill and it's worth doing the effort to get there rather than a shortcut. So many people asking questions. Yeah.
I'm not in the, okay. My name is Kinley. I work for Academic Technology Solutions as an instructional technology assistant, but I'm also a full-time graduate student at the Div School. I study early Christian history. So I've thought a lot about AI, as well a lot about the humanities and theology and philosophy. So I have a stake in a lot of this and all of this, as we all do. As a busy grad student who is not unique, I have a part-time job on top of things. I'm constantly running around. Finding time to sit down and think is one of the most integral parts of both my job and my scholarship. Yet we exist not only at a university, but in a broader culture that prioritizes speed and speed in processing as it's the benefit for your work, to the point where even I, as someone who is deeply hesitant about the use of AI for my own formative development, has been writing at 10 p.m. thinking, if I just had a little bit of a push, I could get this in. I know we've circled around quite a few of, I'm not quite sure how to approach this, what do we, so I suppose this is just another way of posing that, but in the specific way of how do we as instructors model and also structure our courses within a 9-week quarter, that's very fast, to slow down and let students fail so that they can think about AI, so that they can build those developmental tools, even though it is directly oppositional to monetary interests and whatnot. That's the main question. I have a second one that's just very brief. The term bullshit has been thrown around a lot and quite frequently, which to me hails back to a paper that was published, I believe, in July of 2024 called ChatGPT is Bullshit, which appeals to the specific philosophical concept. I was wondering if that is informing what we say when we mean bullshit, or if that's just a general term.
Right.
And if so, if we could perhaps gloss that.
Sure.
If not, don't worry about it, but my prior question comes first.
Just about bullshit. I'm not sure. I heard Joe talk about it when he came to the department. But what I'm talking about is stuff that. So the whole thing is that it's fluent, right? It sounds fluent, regardless of how regardless of how confident it should be based on even just the model. It comes off as confident on lots of things, and I take that, and I think bullshit is a good description of that. But I'm not sure if I'm using it fully in the philosophically grounded sense. But on the first one, slowing down. I don't know about slowing down. I also think we should maybe take a lot. I don't know if you want to respond, but maybe we should take more input, because I think lots of us. The point is, I don't think we have the answers on these things, and maybe soliciting more input rather than making us bullshit is a good way to go. I don't know.
Okay, I know of it. Okay, there are 4 people whose hands I have in a mental list, so I'm going to go 5. I will go to those 5 and gather maybe 3 first, and then we'll do the other 2.
Hi, I'm not a scholar. I'm actually a staff here, but I'm also a mother of 3. One just started freshman year in college. And one of the reasons why I'm here is because he told me that he's a business student in a small business school and entered a hackathon competition. And he said he feels that there's a difference, generational difference between the freshmen and juniors and seniors. Because freshmen, he feels like there's a generational difference in terms of how they approach programming. He's not a programmer. And he says, I know just enough about programming to know how to ask AI to program stuff. So his team created like a Chrome extension, won a hackathon competition. And that's great, but he's like, but it's the freshman group because they have no sort of hindrance. Well, if it's faster, let's do it. I'm also Japanese. I used to work as an interpreter. One of the reasons why I'm here is because that's kind of a phased out type of profession. And I mean, there still is, but it's just fewer, far between. And one of the things, over the summer, my son said that I took on a job, and it's actually inputting information for AI in Japanese. So he's bilingual, and I actually homeschooled them, so they did a lot of muscle building. And this was primarily for Japanese. So I knew that, and then I have a 10-year-old who hasn't done that. He's gone to public school, and so there's already a generational difference between my 18-year-old and a 10-year-old who looks at their screen and edits, right? Like they're scrolling. The speed at which they consume the videos is it's just amazing. So I think that speaking about speed, I feel like the speed at which the generation gap in how people are absorbing information and spitting it out or not spitting it, that is shifting at a much faster pace than the generation gap between like our grandparents having a better, beautiful, more expressive handwriting than we do, because or that maybe some of us need to handwrite and think about what we're writing. Some of us need to type to have access. And I think there's those gaps that have slowly come over the years, but that's accelerated to where I think that's the part that's new, not the shift in generational differences. Like the generation, just to hear that he said, yeah, like it's the freshmen who won the hackathon. Mm-hmm. It's the people who, because I would not contribute to AI translation knowledge, whereas he would do that. Because it's like, well, I'm going to get paid. And I'm like, I don't want to. You know, they took my job. And so I think there's that difference between programmers who studied C++, whatever, and then, well, if you can figure out some faster way to do it, they're resistant to doing it. You know, like kind of people using Cuisinart versus chopping by hand.
Okay, 2 more over this side, and then 2 more at the front.
Hi, sorry, I'll try to be quick, but I have a question more on the administrative aspect of AI in our university context. We've talked a lot about how there are unknown negative and positive implications of this technology, and we don't know the future. But we also have one of the most robust security apparatuses of any university in this country, with over 4,000 cameras and keycard pads tracked across Hyde Park, Kenwood, Woodlawn. And we outsource our user interfaces of that security technology to companies that are integrating AI. And so as I've been asked many times by this university not to use AI, and I'm totally on board, are there places we should be asking them not to implement this new technology, as we don't know what's going to happen next?
That's cool.
Hi. So if we could, I was thinking of dividing what's been talked about into 2. One is the replacement of drudgery with AI. I work at the Research Computing Center, so people who are interested in that part, and they like the idea of, or feel that the having an undergraduate label a whole bunch of things specific to what's needed for that research project, and then have the AI use those labelings to do the next 20,000, so that you're still getting the value of the undergraduate. That's very much possible in AI, and that's what we do at the Research Computing Center. So if people want help with that, that's my advertisement. But on the on Anton's point of are we losing the sort of incentive to think deeply? And I think that, and it's connected with the idea that Anton pointed out, that the Phoenix AI was brought to this university without any deliberative process of the faculty or staff or students. And I think that in some sense that's part of the culture of this notion of AI just producing a product, and in which the process is not considered important. At this very instant, there's I think some other thing going on at the university about the University of Chicago's free speech principles or something like that, and it's couched in the notion of neutrality, institutional neutrality, but there's something very non-neutral about the way that the administration constantly portrays what they're doing, for instance, by saying, for instance, that the investments of the university should be decided purely on the basis of the profit at the end, and not on any other concerns considering that have to do with any kind of deliberative process about what are the other goals So I think those are all related things.
Why don't you take these 3 questions, and then there are 2 more questions that I have on my list, and we'll go to those, and then we'll wrap it up.
I want to take the programming question briefly, because I do this. But I do see your point, and there's a generational difference in what gets offloaded to AI versus what doesn't. And I'll be honest, sometimes I do ask, not actually ChatGPT, probably Phoenix AI at this point, to generate code for me. Often I do that to generate an example so I can learn. And I would hope that students are encouraged to do that. But it's that same sort of product-oriented idea. If the goal is just the product, if the goal is just the final iteration of whatever it is you're creating, and the goal is not to learn how to do something, then that's going to be when you use AI, and when you use it potentially irresponsibly and hijack your learning experience. So I don't necessarily have a good way of fixing this. I just think that trying to make the case to students, especially those who are learning computer science, that these models sometimes don't work, and they do make mistakes, and that you have to check the work, and you have to know the stuff in order to check the work, is really the only way that we're going to make any progress on this.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about programming and AI, because what's one of my roles is teaching people to program, and but I don't. We only have like a few minutes, so I can't say all the things. But just 2 things. One is that in programming, we talk about like the level of the programming language. You have programming languages where you're like interacting with, like telling the computer where to store particular bits of information, and that's like a low-level programming language. And then you have these high-level programming languages where it's much more conceptual, and you're sort of saying like, the verbs that you're using are much higher level and don't actually interact with the kind of guts of the computer. And in a way, what people are doing, what your son is doing, and who's a first year, is like an even higher level programming language. It's just natural language to describe a task, and then it kind of gets done. And there's an old, like in computer science classes, there's very often a task which is like, describe how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Have you heard this before? People will inevitably try to describe it, and they'll skip steps, and so the professor will show like, oh, I'm putting the peanut butter goes back in like whatever. They screw it up because they can't describe all the steps. So in a way, what's going on possibly is like moving to higher levels where it's more natural language, but you still have to be able to think through the process and divide a large task into small ones, but just sort of in different ways, which is kind of an optimistic view of it. But I do think it's an area where like you would definitely want to have students go through some of the basics to be able to build those muscles also. I think the thing about security cameras, like, yes, we should. I think you made a great point. I don't think we need to respond to it. And I'll send people to RCS for computer standards.
Okay, so as an academic culture, how do we kind of decide which parts of work are drudgery and which parts are necessary? Like, what is process-oriented and what is practice-oriented? Because thinking about the example of, oh, like, can we summarize all these thousands of abstracts? Can we like draw out the important part of them as well as an undergraduate can? I've had conversations with undergraduates about like, oh, like I don't use ChatGPT to generate writing, and I don't turn in writing that ChatGPT makes, but I do use ChatGPT to make a summary of the reading we're doing so that I don't have to look through this dense reading and figure out the summary. So so what do you guys think about, like, as an academic culture, how do we draw lines between when we're being process-oriented and when we're being product-oriented, when it's like a fact-finding mission when it's a fact-finding mission of how is the AI doing how is the AI doing in this huge data-heavy task versus like the fear of ChatGPT LLM usage becoming a part of the research process in itself that ends up losing a lot of the complexity.
Yeah, so this is a pedagogical question as well about one of the most commonly proposed solutions that I've seen to the problem of undergrads writing papers with AI is in-class essays. And I'm wondering what you make of that and what the consequences might be, particularly changing the idea of writing from something you have to ruminate on and work on in the library to something that's time-bound by an hour 30.
I don't mind in-class essays. I did those in college too. I don't think it's a solution to the real problem. I mean, that's not all writing is not like that, and that's a time-bound exam is not the place to develop your capacity to compose prose. That takes time, rumination, whatever. I mean, and reading is the same. So it's not a solution. This is one of those things. Like I don't see the solution. It doesn't seem to me. I don't want to be boxed into like not assigning papers or something like that because I can't prevent people from cheating on those papers or something like that. So, but I mean, I have no problem with. As long as we've got grades, there have to be things graded. Exams I have no problem with. But the basic thing is it's not gonna substitute for learning how to write. That's not a context for learning how to write.
Yeah, I'm happy to dig into the question about what is process-oriented versus what is product-oriented. I think at the end of the day, it's probably a meditation that we all have to do every time we use AI, but the way that I like to think of it is this possible to do without using AI? So like in the case of Andy's research, it would take so much work, and so many resources in order to get all of that summarization done. If the goal instead is to do a close reading of one resource or a handful of resources, I don't think that's something that needs to be offloaded to AI. The point is the closeness. The point is the specificity of your analysis, and it's specifically your analysis. From a research perspective, I think the way that I conceptualize it at this point is reading widely is so important in research. Butting up against arguments that you didn't expect is a part of research. So hijacking that in any way by asking ChatGPT or Phoenix AI to give you the best resources for your particular argument, I think isn't a very effective use. But asking ChatGPT or Phoenix AI the best terms to use when searching or the best databases, it still might not be the most effective way to go about this problem, but it's not one that's going to actively hijack your learning.
So just before we finish and thank our speakers, I wanted to say one thing in response to the question about bullshit, because this is how I think about AI. And so if I were to ask an AI what the philosophical conception of bullshit were, and I'm going to put it in these terms because Anton almost certainly has a better way of putting this than I do. I believe that the distinction is like the liar really cares about the truth, right? So the liar really cares about you believing that the thing they're telling you is true. So if I tell my friend, it's raining, and he puts on his Wellington boots and he takes an umbrella and he walks outside and it's really sunny, he looks like an idiot. So, I'm happy that I lied to him and he was hoodwinked. Or if I tell him it's raining and it really is raining because I don't want him to get wet, similar outcome. But I take the point about bullshit to be that it's just indifferent to the truth quality of the thing being said. And that, it seems to me, is very similar to the description we got of ChatGPT at the beginning, hence the reason why you need to retain your critical faculties of critical judgment in order for this thing not to lead you down the garden path. Anyway, thank you all very much for coming. Thanks to Andy, Taylor, and Anton for their contributions.